It's the real news. I'm Aaron Mate. On Friday, CNN reported what sounded like a bombshell story.
Hunter, there's a lot that you have gotten in the past day plus. Lay out your new reporting today on this effort to give Trump access to WikiLeaks documents.
Well, Kate, this email on September 4th, 2016 was sent to Donald Trump, then candidate Donald Trump Jr., and others in the Trump organization, including Donald Trump Jr.'s personal secretary. And in this personal assistant, I should say, and in this email, it actually has a decryption code and a link to a web address where purportedly they could have received the hacked WikiLeaks documents.
If this story was correct, that would have meant that the Trump campaign was offered the hacked Democratic Party emails before WikiLeaks published them. But the problem is the story was totally false. Hours later, it emerged that the email that Trump campaign received was dated after WikiLeaks published the emails. In other words, somebody sent the Trump campaign a link to the hacked emails that had already been made public. The story was retracted, but not before fueling a new round of innuendo over alleged Trump-Russia collusion. And the biggest question is how this mistake was made. Both CNN and other outlets confirmed that the story was given to them by multiple sources. So how did all these multiple sources get it so wrong? Well, neither CNN nor MSNBC or CBS have explained their mistake. And in fact, on Sunday, the CNN show Reliable Sources had on David Frum, the former speechwriter for George W. Bush, who coined the phrase axis of evil. And Frum said that the mistake is a reason why the media should be trusted.
You asked the question, Brian, why should, given these mistakes, why should people trust the media? And I would say the mistakes are precisely the reason that people should trust the media. Look, astronomers make mistakes all the time, because science is a process of discovery of truth. Astrologers never make mistakes, or at least they never own up to them, because what they are offering is a closed system of ideology and propaganda. Faced with wrongdoing circled by lies, the process of piercing the lies to uncover the truth about the wrongdoing is inherently not only difficult but adversarial, because the people who are trying to find the truth are operating against bad faith actors engaged in concealment. So they get partial pieces of the truth. In the process, there are going to be overshoots and undershoots.
Joining me is Max Blumenthal, senior editor of Alternet's Gray Zone Project, co-host of the podcast Moderate Rebels. Max, I want to start again just by replaying that clip from David Frum, but just the key part where he says that the mistake by CNN is why we should trust them.
You asked the question, Brian, why should, given these mistakes, why should people trust the media? I would say the mistakes are precisely the reason that people should trust the media.
So that's David Frum, former speechwriter for George W. Bush, champion of the Iraq War, the man who coined the phrase axis of evil, speaking to CNN on Sunday. And it's just so remarkable, Max, that after this massive screw up, CNN offers no explanation for how it happened. And again, brings on the guy who helped sell the Iraq War to say that mistakes are why we should be trusting the media. Your comments on what David Frum said.
Well, we should also acknowledge that David Frum has been involved with Rob Reiner in this initiative, the Committee to Investigate Russia, which we previously panned. It featured Morgan Freeman. So David Frum has been drumming up the Russiagate narrative, and it appears pretty clear from this latest episode that the Russiagate narrative is falling apart, and this pack of opportunistic journalists that have followed it down a rabbit hole are really desperate for news stories, and they can't really find anything. There's no there increasingly, which leads them into these kind of this embarrassing journalistic cul-de-sac where they're just not they're producing erroneous reports. I mean, this follows Brian Ross's embarrassing report. They basically drummed up a narrative which was designed to get Trump into a kind of investigation he couldn't get out of, that would eventually lead to him having to testify, him being subpoenaed, and eventually the president being indicted and impeached. And as far as I can tell, watching Mueller's investigation, it's not really going in that direction, and it's because the narrative of Russiagate is just that. It's not rooted in fact. So what we witnessed on this really remarkable episode of Reliable Sources hosted by Brian Stelter was a window into a cult that's been created around Russiagate. And we've seen through research on cults that when the millennial promise by the cult leader of deliverance is discredited or the cult leader is exposed as a fraud, when the underlying narrative that brought people into the cult is exposed, the cult members deepen their conviction instead of falling into disillusionment. That's kind of the paradox of cult thinking. And that's what's happened here. David Frum comes on and says that we should trust the media because of mistakes, and that the media aren't the ones who are relying on cult thinking. It's its targets. In fact, there's very little factual basis for them to go on to link WikiLeaks to Russian intelligence services. And that was really the essential basis of this CNN story, is accepting the CIA's version of WikiLeaks, which is that it's a hostile foreign intelligence operation instead of a public platform for whistleblowers to expose how the sausage is made in diplomacy and in covert operations. So that's another fact that hasn't really been discussed here. And then finally, David Frum talks about the media as these brave truth tellers who are devoting lots of resources and energy to trying to find out the truth. That's not what happened here. Throughout Russiagate, what we've mostly seen with the journalists who are making their names and careers off it is a total lack of shoe leather. They're basically sitting at their desks and waiting for the latest leak to come in, to arrive in their email, either from the retired members of the intelligence community like John Brennan, or from the House Intelligence Committee. And it appears what happened here is that the House Intelligence Committee, which is driving the Russiagate narrative through leaks, substantially through the office of Representative Adam Schiff, who's the ranking Democrat on the committee, provided false information to CNN, NBC, independently confirmed it through Ken Delanian, who's the reporter who I think lost his previous job because he had been clearing articles with the CIA prior to publication and promising the CIA positive coverage. And I think CBS also reported the same story. So many of these stories are coming out of the House Intelligence Committee through these staffers who are subpoenaing emails from the Trump administration or, Don Jr., the Frito of the Trump crime family. And then they're leaking them to opportunistic reporters who are basically stenographers. And for once, one of the reporters or a series of reporters got caught. But this really needs to go to the House Intelligence Committee and raise questions about their agenda and the veracity of their leaks and how they've created a narrative that really rests on, at best, a very shaky foundation, which is that Trump and his campaign colluded with Russian intelligence services to subvert American democracy and throw the results of the election.
Max, and this is why we're probably not hearing the explanation for how this story was screwed up so massively.
Exactly.
Because as you say, this was not just based on one source. CNN and MSNBC and CBS all said that they had independently confirmed it through multiple sources. But yet nobody has explained who these sources were and how they all got it so wrong. And this was the key point raised by Glenn Greenwald in a big article on this topic in The Intercept on Saturday. So Brian Stelter, who hosted David Frum, and also Carl Bernstein on his show on Sunday in that segment that we played that clip from, I emailed Brian Stelter and I asked him, why didn't you raise the issue of how this massive mistake happened? Because he didn't. He said on his show that the mistake happened and was retracted, but he didn't get in at all to the issue of how it happened. And I asked him, why didn't you raise the issue, and do you plan on raising it? And he referred me to a CNN spokesperson who said that they had no comment. So a refusal, first of all, to demand accountability for how the mistake happened. And then when you ask those who are supposed to be the watchdogs, the people, the media critics like Brian Stelter, if they plan on finding out, they have no comment on why they're not seeking the truth.
Well, first of all, Brian Stelter's put himself in an uncomfortable position because he has rejected any skepticism around the Russiagate narrative and even badgered Trump administration officials who've just merely attempted to deny that they colluded with Russia. Whatever you think about the Trump administration, and I definitely don't think very highly of it, and I doubt many viewers of this will, that the notion of collusion between political campaign in the U.S. and Russian intelligence services is should at least be a matter of debate. But Brian Stelter has attempted to take that debate off the table for the purpose of what I consider, kind of grandstanding. And then, there's the more salient issue of sourcing. Sam Husseini at FAIR, the media monitoring group, wrote a great piece earlier this year asking whether journalists should expose sources who deliberately lie to them or deceive them. And in this case, what we have is a case of high-level deception of journalists, and yet the journalists continue to protect the sources that lied to them. Why are they protecting the sources that lied to them? Without those sources, it's like, it's like they're pretty much going to watch their watering hole evaporate. The parrots in the parrot jungle aren't going to have their bird feeder anymore, because that bird feeder is the House Intelligence Committee that's been feeding them all these leaks while they just sit at their desk, wait for the leaks to arrive, and then report them and frame them as sharply as possible, like the good little stenographers they are. So they would basically be depriving themselves of their journalistic lifeline, if you can even call it journalism at all. And I think, media critics, a principled media critic, would start asking questions about what's going on inside the House Intelligence Committee, and whether it really is an investigation or a political ploy to create a narrative that is actually having, I would consider, dangerous diplomatic effects and ramifications, from the raiding of Russian consulates to the sanctioning of Russia over the objections of European Union countries, to a total collapse of U.S. Coordination with Russia in conflict areas like Syria. So, to a lot of people in the media, this is just about making their careers, but this is having real-world consequences.
Max, you mentioned how some journalists are convincing themselves that they're challenging Trump by focusing so intently on the whole Russia issue, while at the meantime ignoring voices like yours who are skeptical of the whole Russiagate narrative. And our friend Brian Stelter, who we've mentioned, actually, I have an example of that. He had White House counselor Kellyanne Conway on a show earlier this year, and he confronted her for not doing enough to protect America from Russian interference. This is that clip.
Russia collusion, which has to do with the campaign. You're not talking about it here as we're governing, right? That all has
the way
to do with
that
the
Russia
campaign,
attacked us last year is the biggest story
now
I can
you're talking
think
about
of.
the campaign.
Russia
Okay,
continues to attack us today. They're going to attack us in the midterms, Kellyanne, and I don't see your boss doing enough to protect us.
I don't see your boss doing enough to protect us, Brian Stelter says to Kellyanne Conway. And I just thought, Max, this is such a good snapshot of where our media is at now, ignoring dissenting voices, ignoring, for the most part, Trump's actual policies, and trying to go after him so hard on this Russia issue, which, as both you and I have covered extensively, and as you mentioned earlier, the evidentiary basis of it is so thin, and but yet the refusal by the media to jump off the wagon.
But yeah, if they jump off the wagon, well, they're circling the wagons. They're in kind of a logger right now, and that's what we saw on Brian Stelter's latest reliable sources. And Carl Bernstein is brought on also because he has been sort of in the limelight to indulge the liberal delusion that Russiagate is Watergate, that there is a real scandal afoot. Carl Bernstein isn't a working journalist who's investigating, and he doesn't know anything about Russia. He's just there as a symbol for liberals to convince themselves that impeachment is over the horizon, and that this is, as Brian Stelter said, the biggest story right now, and that Russia attacked us, and that no skepticism is possible. Skepticism means giving in to Trump for the hardcore partisan liberals who started this shabby narrative. And now they've put themselves in a really impossible situation where it's not really adding up. The Michael Flynn indictment was a perfect example. It didn't show collusion with Russia. It showed Michael Flynn, first of all, beseeching Russia not to implement any countermeasures against U.S. sanctions, which any diplomat would do, basically begging Russia not to retaliate. Russia asked for nothing of Michael Flynn. And the collusion that it showed was with Israel, which we've discussed previously, with Jared Kushner acting on behalf of Benjamin Netanyahu, dispatching Flynn to ask Russia to use its veto power at the UN Security Council to stop a resolution condemning Israeli settlement activity. So none of this is adding up, really. The best they have are these bit players like, George Papadopoulos, who I previously thought was the father of the child sitcom star Webster before I heard about him in this investigation. And they're not able to issue accountability for each other because they've all played into this narrative in one way or the other. And it's not just corporate media, it's also progressive media. I mean, Mother Jones took all of this money from a right-wing oligarch who's behind the Real Clear Politics empire to start its Russia investigation. The Center for American Progress had its Moscow Connection project. Democracy Now! Has been pushing the Russiagate narrative. I've seen it in so many places that, it's really hard for anyone to take accountability. We're basically going to have to wait for Mueller's investigation to end. But, just one quick point there is that I see a lot of similarities between the what's called the Russia investigation, although it almost only peripherally deals with Russia now, and Ken Starr's Whitewater investigation. You go back to the Clinton era when the Clintons fell under investigation for maybe a shady land deal, and it wound up with Bill Clinton's impeachment for his sexual peccadillos. So this investigation could continue for a long time and wind up having nothing to do with Russia. But what's important for many liberals and for a media that feels like it's under attack from Trump is simply to get the president. And it doesn't matter if it proves their narrative or not, as long as they can all escape accountability.
Two things, just for those who weren't around in the 80s, Max was referring to Webster, the TV series starring Emmanuel Lewis, where the father,
Yes.
the father's character's name was George Papadopoulos, similar to the name of George Papadopoulos, this low-level Trump aide who's been indicted for lying to the FBI, who says he was told by some people that they have contacts with the Russian government. And the second thing, on Israelgate, Max, I just want to mention, you and I covered that story.
Can we play a quick clip of Webster judging the Merriam-Webster dictionary competition and on South Park?
Maybe next time. And the second thing, on Israelgate, Max, you and I covered that immediately here on The Real News, and it's been striking to watch that for all this focus over the past year on foreign meddling and foreign influence over Trump, there's been almost no coverage at all of Israelgate, except for you wrote a big piece on it in Alternate. I wrote about it also myself in The Nation. It's just been quite striking to watch that absence. But maybe that will change. Probably not. We have to leave it there, though. Max Blumenthal, senior editor of Alternet's Gray Zone Project, co-host of the podcast Moderate Rebels. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.